All right. How is everybody doing? I feel like it's been forever since I have greeted all of you. So good. Come on, dramatic music. It's so good to see everybody. Uh, don't forget to go ahead and tag people. I know I gave like various times for this and trying to fit this in my schedule this weekend, but I know I want to do it. So make sure you tag people, let them know that we're on. I'm gonna be on for about an hour, and then I'll let you guys enjoy your weekend. People that missed it definitely can catch the replay because I'm believing it's going to be some good stuff we're going to talk about today. So it is good to see everybody. I hope everybody's been doing good with their reading assignments. I am this is airing on my personal page. This is airing on YouTube. So for those of you that are not in the Bible in One Year group, be sure to search and find that group on Facebook. We are building a community of believers together, and we are journeying through the Word of God. And this year, our focus has been on the New Testament. And so you want to be sure to hop in on that. There are some great things that are going to be added, some great things coming. Working on all that good stuff. My schedule is shifting, so I'm getting ready to arrange a lot of things and give you guys some more content and stuff like that. So be on the lookout for all of that good stuff. But I did want to, I know I had not jumped in this group to give an overview of anything in a couple of months now, actually, probably. I did hop in here when I did have a word of the Lord. I guess it's been about a month or so ago about synchronization and how heaven was synchronizing your life and your world with his plans and his purposes. And I believe that we're going to continue to see that throughout the duration of this year. So please set your heart and expectations regarding that, because that is still the word of the Lord for us in this season. But I know we had just completed First Corinthians, and that is definitely a pivotal book for our time, for our day, for our culture. And so I want to kind of give an overview of that book, give you kind of like the keys you need to unlock it, and then I'll let you guys go. Alrighty. So hopefully you guys have tagged people and let them know that we are in here and we are going to get started and jump right in. Waiting for your school to begin. It is definitely in the works. Starting a school is there's so many moving parts to it, I should say. And I don't want it to be like anything else out there or anything that I've seen. Not that there's anything wrong with what I've seen. I just want it to be what's in my heart. So because of that, I am doing a lot of trial and error with the school stuff, kind of ironing some details out about that. However, when it does launch, that is in the works. However, when it does launch, it's going to be that first year or so is going to be strictly for teachers or people that feel like they have a call to teach, they have a grace to teach, and they want to teach as a part of the school. So my first year or so is going to be strictly focused on them, training them, giving them information, giving them revelation, giving them my mind regarding stuff. And then we'll kind of go from there. But that is in the works and it is still coming. So be on the lookout for that. And let's go ahead and get started. So I do like seeing you guys' names on here. So if you have not given StreamYard permission, be sure to click that link that you see so that I have permission to see your name when the comments come in. And let's go ahead and jump in and get started. So if you guys are ready, go ahead and give me a thumbs up to let me know that you are ready. You are ready. All right. While I'm running, okay, good stuff. All right, now while y'all are in, go ahead and let's go over to First Corinthians. Good stuff. I got YouTube people in here. This is dope. Okay. Go ahead and go over to First Corinthians. First Corinthians. And I'm going to give a backdrop of where we are, what's going on in this particular city, this particular church, and with this particular epistle. Now, let me give you background here for this. Again, for this epistle to Corinthians. What we have in our English Bibles today is that we have two epistles from Paul called First Corinthians and Second Corinthians. Right, First Corinthians and Second Corinthians. However, what we later learned through research and study is that these are not the only epistles that Paul wrote to Corinthians. That if we were to properly label those epistles, what we would really have is that First Corinthians in our Bible is really Second Corinthians, and Second Corinthians in our Bible is really Fourth Corinthians. There are four different epistles that Paul writes, and with that knowledge, we kind of get some insight into the nuances of Paul's apostleship, of Paul's leadership, of some pros and cons dealing with Paul's spiritual sons and spiritual disciples and proteges. Because what we learn is the two letters or the two epistles that are not included in our Bibles were written, one, out of haste. The first epistle to Corinthians, Paul wrote it out of haste. He didn't hear everything. He didn't get everything. He just wrote it out of haste and immediately began to slap them with biblical principles regarding stuff that he had incomplete information on. It was a leadership error, but it was a leadership growth point. Is that Paul learned to slow down. That if you're going to apostolically assess a city, a church, a region, a territory, or a people, that we've got to make sure that we have all the information and all the intel we need to judge it and assess it accurately. So the first epistle was given out of haste. There's a third epistle that we don't have in our English Bibles, and that epistle was written out of anger. It was severe. It was harsh. It was rigid. It was bringing the hammer down. And we get intel of that in Second Corinthians because Paul begins to make apologies or amends as that and he references how he was so severe or how he was so harsh and how he should not have been. So we have two epistles that are not in our Bibles. One was hasty, one was harsh. So you have haste and you have harsh that are missing in our Bibles. But First Corinthians comes after the hasty letter. Now, another thing that that you need to keep as a framework when you're reading First and Second Corinthians and when you're studying First and Second Corinthians is that First Corinthians is Paul's apostolic assessment of that church and what was going on in that church. All right. It was Paul's opinions, attitudes, thoughts, apostolic assessment of that church. Second Corinthians is what the Corinthian people, it is in response of what the Corinthian people thought and felt about Paul. So you got First Corinthians is about what Paul felt and thought about them. Second Corinthians is Paul's response into what the Corinthians felt and thought about him. So you're going to see more so in First Corinthians. It's all about the people. It's all about adjusting the people. It's all about growing the people. It's all about correcting the people. It's all about aligning the people. It's all about giving the people the primary focus. By the time we shift to Second Corinthians, this is about Paul. Paul, this is he's responding to what the Corinthians said about his ministry, about his manhood, about his personhood, about what he was doing with the offerings, about why he called himself an apostle, about why he felt like he had authority over certain things when he should not. All of that Paul addresses in Second Corinthians because it's about him versus First Corinthians is about the people. Now, what we also begin to discover in the book of First Corinthians is that the city of Corinth, we've got to understand the city. Now, this is a principle to remember, that if you want to understand the church that is in a particular area, you've got to understand the city it's in, because the city that the church is in is going to impact the people in that house. You know, we're not separated from the city. We're not separated from what is going on around us. It's going to impact us. Watch this. And when it impacts our character, we're going to move into carnality. When it impacts our mission and our purpose, or when it impacts our mission, then we're going to move in purpose. I'm gonna say that to you again. When the city that you reside in, when it impacts your being, your person, is going to affect your character. All right. And it's going to cause you to be carnal. So when the city affects your character, it's going to cause you to be carnal. That's what I want you to hear. When the city impacts your character, it affects your character. It affects how you treat people. It affects how you relate to people. It affects how you live your life. When the city does that, you're going to move into carnality. But when the city impacts your mission, then you're going to move into purpose. Now, why is that so? It's because if I live in a city that is predominantly urban, I can't have suburban mission goals in order to advance the kingdom of God in that city. I need to let the city begin to impact me and hit me in the mission area so that I can adjust and move in purpose. Because what works in Alabama is not going to work in Washington, D.C. And what works in Washington, D.C. is not going to work in L.A. But why? Because the city is going to impact the mission, which is going to adjust how I live in purpose. Okay. But when I allow the city to hit my character and change who I am and how I behave, now I'm going to move into carnality. So what was happening in the city of Corinth, right? What was happening in the city of Corinth was that a carnality was going on. The culture was very demonized. All different types and sorts of stuff was going on in that particular city. Now, what happened was Paul began to address them because the church at Corinth was not allowing the city to hit them in their mission so that they could move in purpose. All right. What they did was they allowed the city and the culture to hit their character. Culture does not need to be ignored. It needs to be prioritized. Culture does not need to be ignored. It needs to be prioritized, because if the culture is moving in one direction, we've got to make sure that the message of the kingdom and the gospel is hitting the hearts of the people. And you can't hit the heart if you're irrelevant. And you find relevance in the culture. All right. I found my point of relevance in the culture. I don't find my identity in the culture. I don't find my purpose in the culture. I don't find my God in the culture. But what I will find is my relevance in the culture, so that I can be sure that when I aim the message of the gospel, I'm aiming it right. All right. So we've got to have a balance between the two. Paul comes on the scene and he realizes that the church is out of balance. He rebukes the church of Corinth. The entire church is in a state of carnality. Why? And if they are in a state of carnality, it's because the culture is not in its proper place. All right. The culture is not in its proper place. And so what Paul begins to do is he begins the adjustments. You're going to read, when you're reading through 1 Corinthians, Paul immediately comes in on this whole, I follow so-and-so. I follow so-and-so. I follow so-and-so. And, you know, we're going to make the Bible really relevant. And so let's put it in our day and age. Paul addresses the church and he walks in and says, you know why y'all are carnal? And you know how I know that the culture is affecting the church rather than the church affecting the culture? Is because y'all are sitting in churches and saying that I am a Paul. Y'all are sitting in churches and saying, I am of Bishop Jakes. Y'all are sitting in churches and saying, I'm of Stevenson. Y'all are sitting in churches and saying, no, I'm of Joel Osteen. Y'all are sitting in churches and creating factions and sects within the kingdom. And that tells me that you are allowing the culture has the wrong priority, because it's the culture that says that we are part of the beehive. It's the culture that says we follow Drake. It's the culture that says we vote for Kanye over Drake. It's the culture that does that. And so when the culture starts steering and navigating the church, then you come over in the church and now everybody is named after whoever their leader is. And Paul says, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, I'm glad I didn't baptize none of y'all jokers. I'm glad none of y'all go to any of my church. I'm glad I'm not y'all pastor. I'm just y'all apostle. I'm glad I didn't lay my hands. I'm glad because y'all are in a mess. You're carnal. You don't know how to talk right. You don't know how to behave right. You don't know how to be there for one another. You don't know how to be pillars in the house of God because y'all are mirroring the culture. What y'all have begun to do is look at the culture and then try to pattern the church after what you see in the culture, and realize, oh, you know what, in the culture, in the culture of Corinth, it was very liberal. It was very free flowing. People did what they wanted to do. They slept with who they wanted to sleep with. At the pinnacle of the city, at the top of the city on a hill, there was a temple that was dedicated to a Morphodite, who was the goddess of love, or goddess of love. And so what would happen in the nighttime of that city is that the priests of that temple would turn into prostitutes, because sex is always spiritual. That's another lesson. Sex is always spiritual. So the priests of that temple would turn into prostitutes at night, and through their ministry or service or prostitution, they would be offering sacrifices to their gods. And so they had no boundaries around their sex life. They had no boundaries around their sexual desires. They had no boundaries around their sexual proclivities, because they were mirroring the culture. The culture was that way. And so when they got introduced to the kingdom, hear me, when they got introduced to the kingdom, they loved the message of grace, and they loved the message of liberty, and they loved the message of freedom, but they interpreted the message of grace through the lens of the culture. I wonder if that sounds familiar to today. They interpreted the message of grace through the lens of the culture. And we have to be careful that while we are preaching grace, which I preach grace, we got to be careful that while we're teaching grace, and I teach grace, we got to be careful that while we're prioritizing grace, and I prioritize grace, that we've got to be careful that in the message of grace, we're not preaching it through the lens of our culture. Because grace does not give me the liberty to live any kind of way I want to. Grace does not give me the liberty to be okay and at home in my weaknesses and in my frailties. Grace gives me the power I need to live up to the standard of God. I must say that to you again, is that grace does not give me the liberty to live any kind of way I want to. That if I receive grace that way, it's because I'm interpreting grace through the lens of the culture. What grace does is that it gives me the power to actually live up to the standards of God. So for instance, God had a thought about lying under the old covenant. He still hates lying in the new covenant. What grace comes to do is not to shame me about my lying. Grace does not come to shame me about me not being a truth teller. What grace comes to do is say, hey, I've come to remove the shame off of you from what you've done. But not only have I come to remove the shame, I've come to give you the power you need to be a truth teller. So now I don't want you living under the condemnation of what you've done, but I also don't want you to live under the weakness of where you've been. I want you to have greater strength. Okay. I want you to have greater strength to move in the purposes, the plans, the standards, the precepts, the edicts of God. Okay. So that is what grace interpreted right. But Paul was a preacher of grace. He was a preacher of righteousness. But Paul confronts the church of Corinth, and he opposes them apostolically, because he says, wait a minute, y'all are not getting grace right. What y'all use grace for is to come out from under shame. Y'all are using grace to come out from guilt. Y'all are using grace to come out from under condemnation. But what y'all need, that's good, because that's part of the work of grace. I thank God for the grace of God, because it's because of his grace, I don't have to hold my head down. Because of his grace, I don't have to be inferior. Because of his grace, I don't have to live in condemnation. Because of his grace, I don't have to worry about anything I've ever done. I don't have to worry about any weakness that I have. I don't have to, watch this, any weakness that I have yesterday, today, or tomorrow. I don't have to live in fear of my humanity because of the grace of God. But what I do need to press into is, not only do I not have to live in the fear of my humanity because of grace, but I can live in the power of Christ. I can live in the strength of Christ. I can live in the might of Christ because of his grace. Right? So I have not pressed into grace. This is one of the core messages that Paul is trying to unravel with the church at Corinth. is that I've got to press into grace until I'm no longer full of shame. I've got to keep pressing into grace until I'm no longer am holding my head down. But I've got to keep pressing into grace until I tap into a supernatural strength, a supernatural ability to live righteously. All right. Because until grace is leading me into righteousness, I have not tapped into grace yet. I may be living in mercy, but I'm not living in grace. I'm not living in grace until I'm growing in the knowledge of Christ. I'm not living in grace until I'm growing in my ability to say no. I'm not living in grace until I'm growing in my ability to be conformed to the image of Christ. Transformation is the fruit of grace, not emancipation. If I leave myself at emancipation, I may live in the land called mercy. But when I move into a place of transformation, I've left mercy and moved into grace. All right. So Paul comes onto the scene here, and he assesses the Corinthian church. He says, y'all are carnal. Y'all are carnal. Now, the flip side of their carnality, watch this, is because even though they were carnal, they also were heavenly gifted. I know this sounds like today. They also was heavenly gifted. So they had an understanding of the message of grace, but they only understood grace from the place of shame and condemnation. And because, watch this, when you liberate people from shame, when you liberate believers, I should say, from shame and guilt and condemnation, it makes it easier for them to flow in the supernatural and to flow in the gifts of the Spirit. Watch this, because the reason why you don't operate in your gifts is because normally it's connected and rooted to some type of guilt, some type of shame, some type of condemnation. You know why you don't prophesy as much as you should? You don't move in miracles as much as you should? Is because you think you haven't prayed enough. You think you haven't read your Bible enough. You think you haven't walked nicely enough. You think you haven't been as loving as you should have been, as kind as you should have been, as patient as you should have been. You're working on other stuff in your life. Watch this. So when you live under that ceiling of shame and that ceiling of condemnation, and now I can't break past that ceiling to get into power and to get into gifts because I always think that I'm not worthy enough to operate in it. I'm not worthy enough to move in that type of power. I'm not worthy enough. So when I begin to tap into half of the message of grace, and I realize this is not about my worthiness, that I'll prophesy, that God will use me to prophesy, and it has nothing to do with me. It's all about God. And so I'm not limited by my own weaknesses and frailties. I'm liberated from that. I can stay. I don't care where I've been. I love that about the gospel of the kingdom, is God doesn't care where I've been, what I've done, what I've been wrapped up in, what I've been bound in. He has come to set the captives free. And because there is true freedom in that, now I can move in the gifts. And that is what is happening with the church of Corinth. They were freely moving in the gifts. Freely moving in the gifts, right? Freely operating in the gifts. But their character was so full of carnality because they knew how to be free from condemnation. They just didn't know how to be free enough to be transformed. All right. So they journey through. Paul begins to address the church of Corinth, and he tells them, hey, I've got to realign where y'all put y'all faith in, because now you have to be careful. Slaves. This is my brain is all over the place. So hopefully all of this is making sense and succinct. When you emancipate slaves, because contrary to popular belief, everybody is or was a slave before you come into the kingdom. All right. So, but when you emancipate slaves, what you're going to have to fight is their allegiance to the man or woman that led them out. It happens all the time. What happens? I'm going to say that to you again. When you emancipate slaves, what you're going to have to fight is the allegiance, or another word for it, the idolatry of the deliverer. All right, let's take it all the way back to the Old Testament. When you have a nation of people that have been in captivity and slavery for 400 years, and Moses comes along as their deliverer, and he has to persuade, he has to convince, he has to maneuver that heart, to massage that heart, to get that nation of people to believe that he could deliver them. And Moses had a battle. The slaves fought their deliverer. They complained against their deliverer. They were agitated by their deliverer. They were annoyed by their deliverer. They disobeyed their deliverer. They didn't always listen to their deliverer. But when their deliverer died, it became hard for them to transition to new leadership. Why? Because I may fight you all day long, but if you are the one that God used to deliver me, I'm going to have to fight that temptation to idolize you. All right, because that's what slaves are groomed, and they're cultivated in a culture of, I need an overseer. Okay, I need somebody that's going to do this for me. I need somebody that's going to grab me by the hand and walk me step by step. I need you to take care of me. You've got to take care of me. You've got to do this for me. That's a very slave mentality. You've got to do this for me. You got to do this for me. And whenever you take away the leader that is doing this for me, I'm going to react and I'm going to respond, and I may cuss you out, and I may have an attitude, and I may want to fight. Why? Because with that slave mentality, you're taking away from me the person that is doing it for me. Paul comes into this scene with the church of Corinth, and they have been liberated. They've been snatched out of the kingdom of darkness, but now they have developed an ungodly allegiance that looks like idolatry to their leaders. They say, you know what? They begin to idolize Peter. They begin to idolize Paul. They begin to idolize Apollos, and not because these people were making them idolize them. They were idolizing them because that's what slaves do when you emancipate them. If you don't point them and get them connected back to the source, they're going to connect and develop an idolatry towards the human being that escorted them into freedom. So Paul had to deal with it diligently, because how do I protect and guard honor for leadership and not lead this church into idolatry regarding leadership? I mean, I know y'all think I'm talking about the church today, but we're talking about Corinth. But that was the war. That was the tug of war. How do I protect honor, and how do I safeguard them from idolatry? How do I protect honor? How do I safeguard them from idolatry? Watch this. How do I know the difference? Paul said one of the ways you're going to know the difference between honor and idolatry is that idolatry is going to cause dissension. Idolatry is going to cause division. Idolatry is going to cause carnality. Honor is going to promote the growth of the body. Honor is going to promote the flow of the oil. Honor is going to promote the advancement of the kingdom. So am I seeing advancement or in growth, or am I seeing carnality and division? And wherever there is carnality and division, that is a sign that there is idolatry and not honor. All right. Idolatry and not honor. Paul begins to draw that line as he begins to journey with them in the book of 1 Corinthians. Right. Now, another important thing about Corinth, the city itself, is that it was twofold. And we're going to see this demonstrated in the church as well. The city of Corinth had two folds to it. Not only was it a wicked city, I mean, anything you could think of was going on in the city. The city was so wicked that it became a proverb of the day. To live like a Corinthian meant to live like a drunkard, or to live in immorality, or to live out there just wilding out. That was the proverb of the day. So instead of people saying you out there wilding, because that's what they say now, you out there wilding, they would have said you out there living like a Corinthian. That was the nature of the city. Very, liberal and open. On the flip side, the city was also one of the most prosperous areas in that day. It was a place of trade. It was the world. It literally was, at some point, the world would cross paths with the city of Corinth, because trading was done there. Right? Trading was done there. So you have trade going on. You have business going on. You got second to the Greek Olympic Games. There was a second level of games that was pretty dominant in that time that was done in Corinth. So you had sports was prevalent there. Entertainment was prevalent there. Sex was prevalent there. Money was prevalent there. Business was prevalent there. All of that was going on in the city. It was a prime place to broadcast the gospel, because the world came to Corinth. The world passed through Corinth. much like that in the church of Corinth. They were prosperous in spiritual gifts. They were prosperous in revelation. They were prosperous in all of these different aspects, but then they also had a deficit in their character. They had a deficit in their ability to be transformed into the image of Christ. All right. So what Paul begins to do, and what Paul begins to begin to build in them, is he brings them back to the core of the gospel. And that's where I kind of want to harp in on, because I by no means can go through all 16 chapters of First Corinthians. I can't do it. Can't do it. All right. I wouldn't have the time. That would be several teachings and several classes and stuff like that. But I do want to hone in on the heart of the book. How did Paul get this church back together? Now, I want to preface before I go into that, though, is that after this, Paul sent the letter of First Corinthians by way of his spiritual son, Timothy. He sent the letter of Second Corinthians by way of his spiritual son, Titus. Now, the makeup and the build of those two sons caused those letters to have different responses. Remember, I said the real First Corinthians, which is not in the Bible, was a very hasty letter. And so Paul wrote what we call First Corinthians, which is really Second Corinthians. But Paul wrote this in response, so as a backup to that, because he realized he was too hasty in his judgments about certain things, and he needed a fuller picture to fully address what was going on. When he sent First Corinthians, technically Second Corinthians, back to them by way of Timothy, Timothy was more soft nature. Now, Timothy was more soft nature, predominantly, most likely, probably because he was of a younger nature. And so Timothy had that wrestle of being young and being in leadership, being young and being deputized, being young and being delegated, being young and being authorized. And so he would go into the church at Corinth to deliver this letter. And the people at Corinth they ate Timothy's lunch. They let him have it. And Timothy, because of his soft nature, did not have the fortitude that it would take to instill that apostolic message into the church of Corinth. So you know what they did? Paul sent this letter by way of Timothy to the church of Corinth. Corinth so retaliated, so rebelled, so backtalked, so gave pushback on everything Paul said, that Paul then they give this. Timothy comes back with the message. Paul then writes another letter, which is extra harsh, which is really Third Corinthians, that we also don't have record of in our Bible, but it is a reference in Second Corinthians. But he writes a harsher letter because of how they treated his son Timothy, and how they disregarded what he said in First Corinthians, and how they needed to respect him, and how they needed to bring their lives into alignment. After the harsh letter, but he sends that letter also by way of Titus. Titus is a little bit more older. He has a little bit more firm gripping, and they receive from Titus a little bit better. And so they begin to make the adjustments. That way, what you see in Second Corinthians is Paul still defending his apostleship, but also becoming a little less tense in what he's saying, because there's been some form of reconciliation between the church of Corinth and the apostle Paul. All right. So all of that is going on in the middle of all of this transaction of Paul dealing with Corinth. All right. Highly anointed church, highly gifted church that is ready to do and move and shake things for God. And yet they are allowing the culture to impact what they say about the Christ, how they demonstrate the Christ, and what they believe about the Christ. All right. So they allow that, all of that, to begin to take place. At the core of what Paul begins to give them is he reminds them that everything, now this is what is important. Now, when I give y'all this, I know we think the kingdom of God is resting on deep revelation, is resting on the secret things unknown to mankind. But I'm about to give you the heart of the kingdom and the heart of the message of the gospel of the kingdom, which is what Paul brings them back to. The heart of it all is that everything in the kingdom, all of the commandments, all of the laws, all of the regulations, all of the principles of God, all stem from a core principle called love. Now, I'm going to show you this, why the church at Corinth was so fought in their carnality is because that city and that church had the goddess of love there. So watch this. You got the kingdom of God, where at the core of the kingdom is love. Jesus said you could hang all the law and the prophets on this, which means that there is no law and there are no prophets without the love of God. You got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. Without that as the core, we don't need to hear your prophecy. You can't love. Without that at the core, we don't need to hear your teaching because you can't love. Paul later goes on to say, into the church of Corinth, I don't care that you can prophesy. You could have the greatest faith in all the world that you could move mountains. You could have the type of power in the earth that creation responds to you. You could have the type of power in the earth that you could be like Daniel and the Hebrew boys and be in a pit of fire and not burn. But if you do not have love, you are nothing, and you're bearing no fruit, and you're not advancing, and you're not growing. I know tons of people who synchronize their growth with how well they flow in the gifts of the Spirit. I know tons of believers who think that their transformation is measured by how well they prophesy and how much word of knowledge they have, on how many, on whether or not they can move in healing and miracles. And Paul said, heal all you want to, cast out all the devils you want to, raise the dead all you want to do, change creation all you want to do. But if you don't have at the core of it the love of God, you are a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal, which means sounding brass and tinkling cymbal. It means that you are an instrument with no purpose. You are an instrument with no purpose. So I don't care that you can prophesy. You can be the archbishop. You can be the greatest chief apostle. You can be the master prophet. If you don't have love, you are an instrument with no purpose. You're making a lot of noise. You're doing a lot of feats and a lot of signs and a lot of wonders, but you're an instrument with no purpose. And when you are an instrument with no purpose, I guarantee you, we're always going to find carnality, because carnality shows up in the life of a believer whose core is not love. I'm going to lie to you. Why? Because I don't love you enough. These are harsh truths that we have to begin to sit with. Why am I in this? You know, I remember years ago, I was dealing with a cycle that I wanted to break, that I knew was not pleasing to the Lord. I was trying to break the cycle. I was on my way home, driving home, and I was talking to the Lord about it. And I was saying, you know, God, hey, I want to come out of this. I want to break this. I don't want to go around this mountain anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. Break me out, deliver me, break me out. And the Lord said to me on the ride home that day, he said, I can free you if you will allow me to love you out of it. He said, I can free you if you would allow me to love you out of it. That at that moment was one of the most mind-blowing things I had heard. I had never heard of being loved out of bondage, being loved out of captivity, being loved into deliverance, being loved into freedom. But it was at the core of what God was trying to communicate to me, that at the heart of this is love. And that when I begin to sit with it and realize it, that if I have carnality in my life, if I have something in my life that does not look like Christ, at the root of it, it's a harsh truth. And I know we don't like it. I don't like it, but I have to sit with it. The harsh truth is somewhere either I don't love God enough, I don't love myself enough, or I don't love my neighbor enough. Every sin is connected to one of those three things. I don't love God enough, I don't love myself enough, or I don't love my neighbor enough. You say, no, well, no, my problem is I like sex. No, your problem is you don't love God enough, you don't love yourself enough, or you don't love your neighbor enough. You say, no, my problem is that people really just tick me off and I have a short fuse and it just irritates me and I just have to let people know how I feel. No, your real problem is you don't love God enough, you don't love yourself enough, or you don't love your neighbor enough. That's the core of it, because it's the message of the kingdom. Now, how the enemy operated was in this city of Corinth, there was a demon called love whose headquarters was in Corinth. The goddess of love, or this demon of love that was hovering over the city, that was stationed over the city, right? That means the culture was impacted by this demonic version of love. And this demonic version of love says it is about me. My relationships are about how they make me feel. What I do in ministry is about how it makes me feel. Now, watch this. Demonic love starts with me. It's going to start with how does this benefit me, right? So even when I'm moving in ministry, you say, oh, I love people. I love people. No, because if I move in ministry and I'm teaching because it makes me feel good, if I'm casting out devils because it makes me feel anointed, if I'm prophesying because it makes me feel like I got a fresh oil on my head, if I'm interpreting tongues because it makes me seem like a sign and a wonder, then what I'm really moving under is that I got to be careful, because I may be moving under demonic love. I may be moving under the goddess of love and not the God of love. Because when it's the God of love, I only want to prophesy because I want to see you move in the will of God. I only want to cast out devils because I want to see you free and delivered. And I know that God wants to see you free and delivered. I only want to move in miracles and healings, not because I want to be anointed, but because I want to see your body at its optimal performance so that you can live out your purpose. Because I realize that the only reason the enemy is attacking your body is because he's trying to really attack your purpose. And that if he can attack the body you live in, he can slow down the purpose you're moving in. So I want to move in healing and miracles because I want to see you in purpose. I love you enough to see you in purpose. I love God enough to see you in purpose. And watch it. So I've got to begin to view it that way, which is why Paul said, I want everybody to move in the gifts, but I'm going to show you all a more excellent way. This is the more excellent way. If you want to pursue prophecy, go for it. If you want to pursue healing and miracles, go for it. If you want to pursue tongues and interpretation, go for it. If you want to pursue deep revelation and wisdom, by all means, go for it. If you want to pursue getting more faith, go for it. If you want to move mountains, go for it. But if you want to know an excellent way, pursue love. Pursue love. Because if you pursue love, then if I'm in pursuit of love, then when necessary, I'm going to prophesy to love you. If I pursue love, when necessary, I'm going to heal so I can love you. If I pursue love, when necessary, I'm going to do tongues and interpretation to love you. If I pursue love, if necessary, I'm going to use my faith to move mountains. I'm going to use my faith to change circumstances. Why? But my heart, the excellent way is love. The excellent way is love. Watch this. Because when the excellent way is not love, then that means, and if I only hold on to the gifts and I only hold on to supernaturally moving, I'm so powerful in God, I'm so anointed, I'm just, the power of God is on me. If I hold on to that and forfeit love, then it's going to be back about me. And I'm really offering sacrifices to a demon called love versus the God who is love. All right. So Paul says, hey, I've got to align this church. I've got to bring this church back into alignment. I've got to bring this church back into proper perspective, right? So what I've got to begin to do is I'm going to give y'all instructions about your character. I'm going to tell y'all that you're immature. I'm going to give you signs on how to locate your immaturity. I'm going to give you signs because y'all celebrate your pastors and your preachers and your apostles more than you celebrate Christ. You're in carnality. You're babes. I know y'all got revelation and wisdom, but you're a child. All right. Y'all getting drunk during communion. I know you so anointed and you can tell people their telephone numbers. You can tell people what they did yesterday and you can prophesy accurately the future. But y'all getting drunk at communion, you're a baby. You're carnal. You're acting like children. I know y'all are anointed. But y'all sleeping with whoever you want to sleep with. There's no faithfulness. Watch this. Because there's no faithfulness in your service and worship to God, there's no faithfulness in your sexuality. So Paul says, you know what? Because that is going on, and because that mixture is going on, you're still a child. You're a babe with your anointed self. You are an anointed baby. I mean, the oil is increasing on your life as a child. That's what Paul says. He says, all of y'all, it's just a bunch of children. But if you want to begin to grow up, if you want to begin to mature, if you want to begin to be who God has called you to be, pursue the excellent way. Pursue the excellent way. Y'all have got to go back to loving God. loving yourself, and then loving your neighbor. Now, that is the proper order, because I can't love my neighbor if I don't love myself, and I can't love myself if I don't love God. Now that is a simple yet profound truth. I've got to start with loving God. If I don't start with loving God, I'm never going to fully love myself. And I cannot love beyond, watch this, love is the result of what's revealed. All right. I cannot love before revelation. I can't love before revelation. So when God says to love me with all your heart, mind, and soul, he's saying, I want that to be your response. I want your response to be love because of what I've revealed to you. How do I know that to be true? The Apostle John says this in his epistle. We didn't love God first. Paul says it in his epistle. We didn't love God first. God first loved us. God first loved us. Why? Why could he know? Because remember, you can't love before revelation. So how was God able to love us first? Is because before we were formed in the womb, he knew us. David, that's what Jeremiah said. David then said that while I was in my mother's womb, before I was knit together, you knew my inner workings. You numbered my days. You knew me. So watch this. God is the one that had the revelation first. He knew me first. I was revealed to him first. And so out of that revelation, he loved me. Which means that will do away with, that'll help with shame, condemnation, and guilt. This is why God wasn't sidetracked by Abraham's weaknesses. He wasn't sidetracked by Abraham's acts of disbelief. He knew Abraham. He knew him. He knew his inner workings. He knew his thoughts and intentions. He knew his heart. He knew everything about him before he committed to love him, before he committed to promise him, before he committed to prophesy him. He knew him. And out of his knowing, he loved him. And then once God loves us, he reveals himself to us. And out of us having that revelation of God, I now love him. I love him because he first loved me. I love him because when I was nothing, he loved me. When I was his enemy, he was prophesying over me. When I was working against his plan in the earth, he was making sure that his plan for me stayed intact. I loved him because when I didn't do everything right, he was providing for me. I loved him because when my hands were against him, his hand was working for me. I love the man Christ Jesus. I love him. I love him. Anybody that knows me knows that can send me into a fit real quick as I start meditating on the fact that I love Jesus. I love him. I love him. I love him because I could be in the pit tomorrow. And while I'm making my bed in hell, he is still there with me and he is loving me. He loves me. He loves me. He loves me. And there are things in life that try to come and separate me from his love, and they avail to nothing. They avail to nothing. They're being brought to naught. That's why Paul said, I don't care if it's death or life. I don't care if it's an angel or a demon. I don't care if it's a trial or a peril. I don't care I don't care if it's sword. I don't care if it's pestilence. I don't care if it's a drought. I don't care if it's famine. Nothing is going to get in between me and God loving me. Watch this. And when I see that right, when I receive that right, I'm going to begin to see myself right. When I love God first, I'm going to begin to see myself the way he sees me. All right, think about it. Think about people. Right. Think about people that y'all have been in relationships with, right? Like you fall in love, you're head over heels with them. When you are head over heels in love with somebody, what they think about you matters. And if you're not careful, what they think about you will become what you think about you. Why? Because you started from a place of loving them. And because you love them, you begin to take on how they see you. Right? It works the same way with relationship with God. Because I love God, I'm going to begin to take on how he sees me. And when I see myself right, that's revelation again. Now I can love myself right. All right. Self-love starts with loving God, because if I don't love God first, I'm never going to get to see me right. And if I don't see me right, then I can't love me right. But then once I love God, once I begin to see me through the eyes of God and love myself, now I can love my neighbor, because the Bible says that I've got to love my neighbor as myself. But if I don't love myself, that means I'm going to always have trouble loving my neighbor. That is the threefold cord that makes the kingdom work. That is the threefold cord that makes the kingdom grow and advance, right? Is that I've got to love God, I've got to love myself, and then I've got to love my neighbor. And then out of that pursuit, I'm going to grow in character. Out of that pursuit, I'm going to grow in power. See, it's not one without the other. I'm going to grow in both. I'm going to grow in both if I grow in love. If I hold on to love, I don't have to worry about if I'm going to have the power I need or the character I need, or am I going to be carnal, or if I'm going to be spiritual. No, I'm going to pursue loving God, loving myself, and loving my neighbor. And as a result, I'm going to grow into the stature of Christ. And when I grow into the stature of Christ, I'm going to grow in his character and grow in his power. Because if I grow in his character without growing in his power, I'm still not in the image of Christ because I'm impotent. But if I grow in his power and not grow in his character, I'm still not in the image of Christ because now I'm growing in deception. I'm going to grow in deception if I move in power, not in character. And I'm going to grow in impotence if I move in character and not in power. I want the two to grow harmoniously. And the way for that to grow harmoniously is I've got to grow in loving God. I love him. And then from there, I'm going to grow in loving myself. And then from there, I'm going to grow in loving my neighbor. And loving my neighbor. And we learned from the parable of Jesus with the Good Samaritan, my neighbor is any human being I come in contact with. That's my neighbor. That's my neighbor. So how was it that Jesus was able to heal just by walking down the street? Because the people on the street were his neighbor. How were people healed by Peter's shadow just from walking down the street? Because the people that Peter walked past were his neighbors. And his shadow healed because he had the love of God in his heart. It was the love of God. I know we've been in pursuit of more oil, more power, more strength, more might. I mean, I want to shake the heavens and shake the earth and make it all move and shake and right, all that. No, what I want to do is love. And if I love, the earth will shake. If I love, bodies will be healed. If I love, demons will be cast out. If I love, I will prophesy accurately the word of the Lord. If I love, then the earth will know that I walk the planet. If I love, that has to be my aim, because all of the law, all of the prophets, all of the kingdom is hanging on that principle. And so through 1 Corinthians, Paul begins to address all of these various issues to try to bring them back to the core of Christianity, which is the threefold message of love. Love God, love myself, love my neighbor. And from there, I will grow out of carnality. Whew. All righty, y'all. I hope that gave y'all some insight about 1 Corinthians. Again, Corinthians goes into a whole bunch of stuff about the gifts of the Spirit, about speaking in tongues, about communion, about marriage, various church discipline, lawsuits among fellow believers, all that different stuff. All of those are the nuances of what Paul begins to address in that church. But he's bringing them all back to the more excellent way. The more excellent way. When he talks about lawsuits, he's trying to bring them back to the most excellent way. When he talks about marriage, he's trying to bring them back to the most excellent way. When he talks about the gifts of the Spirit, he's trying to bring them back to the most excellent way. He's not trying to shut down their gifts. He wants them to move in gifts. He wants them to move in power. He just wants them to reveal Christ. And we have got to realize that moving in power alone does not mean you are revealing Christ. Magicians can do that. Witches can do that. Wizards can do that. Warlocks can do that. Moving in power alone does not mean you are demonstrating Christ. You've got to move in power and character. And when the two marry each other, now I am revealing Christ. Because Christ cast out devils, and then he also forgave a woman caught in adultery. Christ raises the dead, and he also lets an underdog of a woman wipe his feet with her hair and wash his feet with her tears. Jesus was a man of great power, but then he also rebuked the religious and the legalistic for overlooking those who needed a doctor, those who needed healing, those who needed the grace of God. We've got to have both. And all right. All right, good stuff. Now, I had a good time teaching this. I hope y'all did. Hope y'all did. Had a good time learning from this. Again, use this as your backdrop now for 1 Corinthians. As we are continuing to journey through 2 Corinthians, keep in mind, Paul is still addressing the same church, all right? Paul is still addressing the same church. He's still addressing the fact that, hey, this is a church that is in the epic center of the world. The world is passing through here. Culture is very prevalent. Culture is very dominant. But I've got to make sure that this church is still pursuing the message of the gospel, the message of the kingdom, and demonstrating and revealing the Lord Jesus Christ in the planet. So even when we move into 2 Corinthians, he is defending his apostleship. He's addressing what they think about him and his ministry. But again, he's trying to bring them back to the core. Y'all don't love me, right? So that's why y'all irritated with how I do, what I do, why I do, because y'all don't love me right. You don't love me right. And when you love me right, then all of these other things are going to come into proper perspective, proper order. All righty. Now, be sure if you missed this, go back, catch the replay. Some good stuff in there for you guys to learn and kind of get an overview of it. I'm going to be more intentional about that. I need to do a Q&A soon, actually. So maybe I'll hop in here and do one of those soon. But I enjoyed. Be sure to catch the replay. Share. This will stay on Facebook for the rest of the day. Tomorrow it won't be. Just as a heads up, it won't be, but it will still be on YouTube. So make sure you go look for Scriptures Revealed on YouTube. And that's where the videos will be hosted. All right, guys, I love you all. Enjoy your weekend. God bless y'all, and go reveal Christ.